Okay.
Good morning. Sorry for the delay, everyone. Today we are talking about climate. Did want to remind you all that I'm not going to be here on Monday, so I will pre-record a PowerPoint for you guys, and we'll put that up on Blackboard for y'all to. I don't know how you want to work that out, Tom, with everyone in seats, but
Yeah, I meant to tell you, for you seated students, if you want, we can come to class and I'll play that recording, and then if y'all have any discussion or that kind of stuff, so it would be kind of almost like what you do anyway. Or would y'all rather just stay home and watch it on YouTube at your own leisure? Any preferences? Especially since a lot of you are going to be staying for the animal science class if you're already going to be here.
yeah.
But I'll show up Monday. I'll be here and I'll connect and I'll play it for whoever's going to be here, and we'll take it from there.
Sounds good. All right. Well, the quiz for Chapter 2 is up, or should be anyway. Haven't tested that from your perspective, but it should be up anyway. Let me know if there's any problems with that. Next week we'll put both 3 and 4 up and kind of move on to soils, kind of our last topic in the first unit. So, and I've got a little lab associated with that for you guys to do as well, outside of class. Anyway, let's get on to climate. It's a lot of this stuff might be kind of repetitive. You might have covered it in other classes before. So I'm going to try to go over it kind of quickly, but if anyone has any issues or needs to discuss anything, just slow me down, stop me. Happy to answer any questions you guys have. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right, you guys see that?
Yep.
Unit 1. All right, very good. All right, so talking about climate, defined as the prevailing weather conditions of an area, and we're looking at all kinds of different stuff in climate. Mostly solar radiation and temperature are the main things that kind of govern everything, and those kind of work together. Second big one, of course, is rainfall, and very closely associated with rainfall is wind. Look at the speed and direction. Of course, how these vary affects the climate over an actual area. Weather is a little bit different because we're looking at the actual values in particular spots versus the actual overall climate. So what kind of climate do we have here, you guys? In really most of Virginia, if not all, really. It's a temperate climate, right? We have 4 seasons. Generally, we're in the mid-Atlantic. Most of our whole mid-Atlantic region has pretty much the same climate, although there are many differences in climate from place to place. And we're going to talk about kind of how climate is affected on the large scale by the continental land masses, mountain ranges, oceans, ocean currents. Things like that are the macroclimate, and that's generally what we refer to as climate itself. However, we can have similar smaller effects caused by a variety of things, and they kind of talk about buildings, ponds, ground depressions, but there are many other things that can also affect the microclimate. And microclimate, can be looked at on a very small scale. I mean, not even just on the farm scale, but even on like a particular row in a crop could have a different microclimate than another. So think about microclimate as being the climate in the place and how it actually affects the crops to a great extent. Macroclimate would affect which crops we would choose to grow, but microclimate would affect how they perform in each individual area. The macroclimate, of course, determines the kind of natural vegetation that grows in an area. In our area, kind of temperate deciduous forest, But it's interesting to note that also the vegetation has an effect on the climate itself. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a few minutes. Also, human activities can modify climates, intentionally or unintentionally. And one of the, probably most significant or most easily seen kind of examples of that is the heat island effect. And generally that's caused by things such as pavement. Lots of asphalt creates a place where heat can be stored and then slowly released, making a heat island. Also, forest clearing is a big thing that humans have done historically that modifies climates, potentially even on the macro scale. Generally, forests help to regulate climate. Trees can compress the air up to 100 times their height above the tree itself. And generally, that's why forests are much more moist. It's interesting to note that basically all of the forests in the east have pretty much been completely deforested at one point, or actually, in many cases, several points. If we were to look at historic photos of your area or our area here, in the 1800s, it's basically the forest was almost completely cleared. And because of that, they had different climate, believe it or not. Kind of more on the micro scale, but also on the macro scale. We're talking about wild plants, generally how they are affected and adapted to particular microclimates and also macroclimates. They have general ecotypes, and they might have greater tolerance to particular climatic factors than the same member of a species elsewhere. And we actually have these same adaptations occurring in cultivated plants. And if we can figure out how to exploit and kind of improve ecotypic variation, then we can often improve crop production. So that's something that plant breeders do pretty much. And really, even on a smaller scale, seed savers. We have anybody in any of the classes that save seeds or part of kind of your farm operation, doing a little bit of seed saving?
We do.
Good. Well, I would definitely recommend that you all look into that, because generally when you save seeds, you're actually kind of altering the ecotype over time, because you're selecting for what performs best in those particular microclimates. Generally, the major energy and driver of climate on the planet comes from, you guessed it, the sun, right? And really, it's not just sunlight that we think of, but if we were to actually quantify that, it's technically electromagnetic radiation. And this figure that they're showing here, between 400 and 700 nanometers, that is what we call photosynthetically active radiation. That's the wavelength that plants can absorb, basically. Some plants can absorb a little bit of ultraviolet or a little bit of infrared on different ends of the spectrum, but for the most part, between 400 and 700 nanometers. This happens to also be the same spectrum that is actually visual light. And this is pretty obvious, but of course, intensity of solar radiation is highest at the equator. And I'm going to kind of skip over some of this stuff because mostly it's pretty obvious. I do want to talk a little bit about day length and why it varies throughout the year. And that is because the Earth's axis. And I think that's something that we, kind of forget about a lot. We are on a tilt, and because of that, that's what causes our seasons. And in, our mid-Atlantic region, it's, caused to be more temperate because of the tilt of the axis and representation throughout the year, excuse me, which causes variations in light intensity. Of course, our seasons are divided by when we have the tilt, kind of when we are tilted closer or further away from the sun. So during the equinox, the Earth's axis is actually not really tilted relative to the sun. It's pretty much straight up. Therefore, day length is 12 hours or 12-ish hours, basically everywhere on the planet. 12 hours of darkness, 12 hours of light. And that's what can trigger the, blooming of particular plants and the changing of the seasons. And those dates, of course, spring and autumn equinox. Hey, we got the autumnal equinox coming up. I think it's September 22nd this year. So it's a little over a week. Kind of an interesting experiment. If you stand up an egg upright at the time of the equinox, then it will stay upright because the Earth is not tilted on its axis. Kind of cool. At the winter solstice, of course, we're tilted away from the sun. And the day length varies from at the North Pole, 0 hours of sunlight, 24 hours of darkness, to 12 hours at the equator. And of course, the opposite on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. In higher latitudes, excuse me, you really can't grow things in the winter, right? Because there's little to no light. So you can actually use artificial light to produce crops. However, in the summer, they have a short growing season, but it is extremely intense, especially if you're growing things like cool season vegetables. You can grow them extremely quickly and very large in these long, cool days of summer, especially in places like Alaska. If you guys maybe do a Google search or something and look at cabbages coming from Alaska in the summer. It's crazy. I mean, they are producing heads of cabbage that are like 50 plus pounds. We're using artificial lights. Usually the best types of lights to use are these high intensity discharge. However, LED, light emitting diode lights, are actually starting to be better and more cost effective than the high intensity discharge. HID lights are things like HPS and metal halide lights that try to emulate the sun's spectrum, basically. So there are definitely ways that we can kind of trick plants into still producing crops without natural sunlight. Of course, some crops, they do that extensively. And in some areas, especially more northern latitudes, artificial lighting is used pretty heavily. The response that plants have to day length is known as photoperiodism. And it's really not just light itself, but the periods of light and dark. And really, one of the crops that we'll look at that in for our area are onions. And generally in the mid-Atlantic, we can kind of go either way. We can go with long day or short day plants. But those plants that flower in response to longer periods of light are long day plants. Those with shorter are short day plants. So depending on the latitude, you might want to adjust which varieties of crops that you grow based on whether they're short or long day plants. Let me kind of skip over that one. Photoperiodism, how plants grow in response to light, as well as plants stretching to meet the light. Those effects are known as photomorphogenesis. How a plant's shape is actually determined by light quality. And that's in response to a light-absorbing protein called phytochrome. It's really pretty cool. And if you want to do an experiment with this, just sit a plant on its side, and it's still going to grow up towards the light. And that is a kind of photomorphogenic response. You could actually even do this without light itself. Plants will still have the same response to the sun's electromagnetic energy without actually even seeing light. It's pretty fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about water. And one of the potentially startling things about water is that most of the world's water is not really usable. The vast majority of it, 97.6%, is in oceans. It's salt water. Much of the remainder, 2.1%, is frozen. So that only gives us a little over, 1% of water that is actually available to us in the form of fresh water. So I think that's a really big issue, and the way that we use water in agriculture can really affect the hydrologic cycle itself, as well as the potential to always have water, sustainable water supply. So on this slide, they just basically depict the hydrologic cycle. I'm sure you guys have seen something like this before. Little change here in this slide. Evapotranspiration is the sum of evaporation from the earth as well as transpiration from plants. Transpiration is basically just the movement of water through the conduit of the plant. So from the soil through the plant and out of the pores of the plant. That's transpiration. And not only does that cool the plant off, I mean, of course, we transpire too, right? We sweat. It's kind of the same deal. But also, plants have to transpire in order to grow. In order for photosynthesis to occur, they actually have to release gases. So that shows us that we actually need not just water, but we also need periods of dry soil, basically. So we want to see water actually moving through and out of the plant for the plant to actually grow. Just a little kind of physics here. The amount of water vapor air can absorb depends, of course, on the air temperature. So the cooler the air, the less water it can hold. And that's why it's so humid in the summer. Is it hot and humid over where you all are now still?
Yes.
Quite a bit. And that's because we still have warm air, right? And it's still holding that moisture. And as we progress into autumn, you'll see that kind of drop off as the air temperature cools. The humidity also drops off. And I'm not sure for you guys, but generally October is our driest month on average, kind of after hurricane season, right? So we're getting hit right now with lots of moisture, but that change is, change in the wind and everything is going to actually trigger seasonal changes and that we have to really kind of plan for in crop production. What happens when rainfall hits the ground? Well, it can either do one or two things. It can infiltrate and actually be taken into the soil, or it can run off. And runoff generally runs into streams and eventually into other waterways. Runoff also is an issue because it can carry pollutants. And in agriculture, it's a big issue because it could carry pesticides or fertilizers from the farm. And we want to keep those on the farm as much as possible. So looking at moisture availability and how water flows in farmland is extremely important. Of course, naturally, plants help to prevent runoff and actually encourage infiltration by channeling water into the root zone, the rhizosphere, and kind of slow the passage of water through the soil. We always have to think about the relationship between precipitation and evaporation because that is a major thing that defines the climate of a region and therefore the suitability for plants and crop growth. If we look at water being held in air, then basically we're looking at humidity there. And we'll look at relative humidity and the saturated vapor pressure. Generally, the higher the humidity, the relative humidity of a body of air, the more difficult it is for plants to transpire, because you can't add more moisture to the air. It's saturated. Identifying temperatures at vapor pressures, we look at the dew point. And this is basically the effect of the temperature on the changing vapor pressure in the atmosphere. So that's another little weather thing that we need to try to be aware of anyway. It's not something that we can control unless you're in a greenhouse, but it is something that we need to kind of be aware of in terms of harvesting of crops. Big thing here, looking at successful water management. We have to regulate the availability of water to meet the evaporative demand. And in some cases, we need to add water, right? We have to irrigate. But in many other cases where we have poorly drained soils or excess rainfall, we actually have to install drainage systems. So it kind of goes both ways. And that's something that you need to examine really on each individual farm, and looking at the kind of microclimate. Where does rain tend to fall? Where does it channel? How do you move it? We have to have good water management in order to optimize crop growth. Speaking of irrigation, there's an extremely long history of irrigation. In this photograph, they're actually looking at old irrigation channels in the Middle East that were used even in prehistoric times. You guys have heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, right? One of the wonders of the ancient world. That was actually a result of a very sophisticated irrigation system. So the way that we move water, we can actually create really productive systems, crop systems, agroecosystems based on how we move water. Today, irrigation might look a little bit more like this. Of course, it depends on where you're at, what kind of crops you're growing. This is just kind of an overhead sprinkler type irrigation like you would see generally like in the Midwest. Often these are on like a pivot system too, to where if you've flown over the Midwest before and you look down, you see all these kind of crop circles. That's irrigation on a pivot system. Overhead irrigation is, it can be relatively efficient. It really just depends on the crop that you're growing. On a large scale, it makes a lot of sense. Generally on a small scale and for more intensive crops, we're looking at using things like soaker hoses or drip irrigation. Drip irrigation is the most efficient in terms of water use and often also in terms of crop growth. However, it's not necessarily the most efficient in terms of the hydrologic cycle. We were on a farm in Oregon, which Oregon's got an interesting climate. I mean, often you think of it as being, extremely moist, right? Well, turns out that, a good portion of Oregon is also extremely dry. And they're kind of in the center of the state. It can kind of go either way, kind of in the Cascade region. So we visited a farm out there that had a very unique and sophisticated irrigation system. And it was all basically overhead irrigation that was gravity fed from a series of ponds at higher elevations. However, they found that when they switched to a drip irrigation system, that their neighbors below them, kind of in their watershed, were not getting as much water because drip is so efficient that it basically is just supplying just what the plant needs. And there wasn't enough runoff to actually recharge the aquifer and enough water for the neighbors. So, I mean, that might be something to think about in choosing an irrigation system. Of course, that was in an area where there was a lot of change in altitude. Generally, kind of where you guys are, where it's a little bit more level, a little less hilly, drip might make more sense. Many of the most productive agricultural areas in the country and also in the world are actually relatively dry climates. And when we introduce irrigation water, we can make those soils extremely productive. The Central Valley of California is one of those prime examples. Because there's not much natural rainfall, there tends to be low pressure from pests and diseases. So by irrigating the crops, especially using kind of ditch and furrow irrigation, where you're watering more of the soil rather than overhead and watering the crops, it's really easy to keep disease pressure down. So it's a very good reason to, why we actually produce crops even in arid regions. However, there are issues associated with that, especially when we're using open canals. It's easy for that water, that irrigation water, to become contaminated. It also, along the way, in a series of locks and canals, picks up salts. And basically, by using some irrigation water, you're salinizing the soil. You're actually adding salt to the soil. And that has to be leached away eventually by fresh water or natural rainfall. Otherwise, it can build up to toxic concentrations and basically destroy crop production. Something kind of associated with moisture availability, if we're looking at natural vegetation in arid areas, we see a lot of things like succulents, right, that have particular tissues that are able to store water. We also see particular grasses that have a different photosynthetic pathway, and that's called the C4 pathway, that basically allows those plants to reduce transpiration but actually increase photosynthetic capacity. So crops like corn and sugarcane, those are the most productive crops on the planet because of that different photosynthetic pathway. Moving on to temperature, which is pretty much the most important factor in crop growth. What kind of crops can be grown and when they can be grown in any given location. Temperature is mostly affected by latitude, kind of as we see here, but it's also affected by altitude. And potentially up to about 6 degrees for each 1,000 feet you increase in elevation. That's why here in the town of Abingdon, we're about 2,000 feet. If you go, about 25 miles from here to the top of Mount Rogers, the highest point in Virginia, it's almost 6,000 feet. So we're, going up 4,000 feet in elevation, and, it can be easily 20-degree difference. It can be snowing up there in May or June where we have, beautiful sunny day at a lower elevation. So that's more of a kind of a microclimate thing that's affected by altitude. Also, water vapor can actually absorb heat radiation. So looking at cloud cover is actually really important in regulating climate, especially at night temperatures. Also used to live in Arizona, as I mentioned before. And even in areas like where we were, not really a desert area per se, it's a heavily forested area, we would still have massive temperature swings, and that's because of limited cloud cover. Nice for the night sky, but some days we would see temperature swings in the winter of up to about 50 degrees. Kind of crazy. Heat is transferred by convection, and convection is basically just movement by a carrier. And the two carriers that we're talking about in convective heat transfer are water and air, and really water and air together. And we have a kind of a comparison here in California. The Salinas Valley versus the San Joaquin Valley, because of the difference in temperatures, if you look at the highs in the highest part of the summer in like July, we're talking about a good 20 to 25 degree difference in temperature just because of elevation. And that determines that in the Salinas Valley, they're producing a lot of cool season vegetables, things like lettuces, celery, cabbage, whatnot. Whereas in the San Joaquin Valley, they're producing more warm season crops. So they're pretty close to each other, but there's a difference in elevation and a difference in that microclimate. Here we're talking about microclimate and just kind of depicting some radiational cooling and, of course, the frost pockets, which generally you think of elevation and altitude as, affecting it only one way. But you have to look at how air drains, too. So generally, cool air flows down slopes and into hollows, and allowing the warm air to rise above, which causes frost pockets a lot of times, especially in more mountainous areas. And what I like to do, especially around this time of year, when we start to see these larger temperature swings, just take a little infrared thermometer and go out and kind of pick on those little microclimates yourself by just pointing it at different areas. Of course, urban development affects temperature all year. That's where we get the heat island thing. We also have lots of pavement causing different movements of water and causing less evaporative cooling. Also buildings blocking wind. There's all kinds of things that cause differences in urban areas to make really totally different, almost a completely different climate in an urban area versus a suburban area or a rural area. Anybody ever been to Phoenix, Arizona?
I have.
Yeah, it's what do you have to say about it?
I was rather young, so flat and dry.
Extremely hot, right? It's like one of the hottest spots or urban zones in the country, and they basically have this like 100-mile, city of all kinds of pavement, and it's really easy to see that urban heat island effect there. I'll never forget going there one time. We got there at about 9 in the morning, and it was already 92 degrees. And I just happened to be in the back of this van where the AC was out, just right above us. And it was because of that, I won't ever forget that moment and the heat island effect. And we already touched on this before, but looking at the plant hardiness zones, again, that's kind of defined by the USDA. They're looking at the minimum temperatures that can be expected, right? It changes, of course, especially years where we have things like the polar vortex. Here's just a general map, and again, we'll probably see this change over time. I think every 5 or 10 years they release a new hardiness zone map. But you can kind of see here, like you guys are over here in zone 7, and we're over here in zone 6. So that determines most of the hardiness of perennial crops, not really our growing season. What does determine the growing season here, and this is just this is looking at a map, I think, of Ohio, looking at the different frost dates throughout the state. And really, it's the frost dates that determine mostly our crop production, because most of our crop production is annual plants, right? If we're doing perennials, then we're going to be looking at the hardiness zones. But if we're doing annual crops, we're going to be looking at this map, the first and last frost dates, to decide when we can sow seeds. And that really is kind of given for an area, but you need to look at the microclimate aspects too. Like here we have students that are in much higher areas causing their growing season to be different by a good 30 days potentially. So look at your first and final frost dates in an area. Usually you can see those on Weather Service websites, but probably the best thing to do would be to ask a local farmer. They know. This slide's just talking about us trying to manipulate temperature around growing crops. There are many ways that we can do that. Of course, we can do that in greenhouse production, but we can also do some season extension on site with things like row cover, high tunnels, low tunnels, and also other ways, like in some cases, it's not practical in many cases, but I have seen people spray water over orchards when there's danger of freezing. That can exacerbate the problem in some cases, but in some cases it lowers the dew point and prevents freezing of flowers. Some people will even put in huge fans in between rows of like perennial crops like grapes, for instance, just to mix the air layers so that you don't have major frost problems. The next few slides are just talking about air movement on a global scale. I'm talking about the rotation of the Earth causing this shift of winds known as the Coriolis effect. And also kind of looking at the trade winds blowing towards the equator. And really that kind of affects how our weather works. Whether we're getting moisture from the Gulf or whether we're getting moisture from the Atlantic or from a nor'easter. So just pay attention to wind and especially the prevailing winds in your area. Let's skip over a little bit of this, starting to run out of time here. But here they're talking about in the central U.S., summer weather being dominated by southeast winds bringing moisture-laden air from the Gulf of Mexico, and in the winter, northwest winds bringing polar air down. So that also affects us to a certain degree, although we also have issues with Atlantic winds and moisture coming from the sea as well. Of course, air movement is slowed by vegetation, and as I mentioned earlier, trees compress air and move it, right? So using wind breaks can affect a microclimate in a particular area. When we're talking about air, especially just dry air, this is kind of a start on the figure, I think, that, generally you think of air as being like oxygen, right? But it turns out that 78% of dry air is actually nitrogen, the dominant gas in our atmosphere. And most of the Earth's nitrogen is in the atmosphere, some of it being in the lithosphere and rocks and soil as well. And the rest of that, that 0.1%, that 1/10 of a percent, is living in organisms, basically, nitrogen-fixing organisms. Talking about nitrogen, which, of course, nitrogen is generally the most limiting nutrient for crop growth. Generally given to plants, they are associated with soil bacteria, both free-living and association with plant roots that are able to convert nitrogen to ammonia. They're basically taking it out of the atmosphere, fixing it in the soil, and allowing it to be taken up by plants. However, we've actually figured out, we didn't, but Fitzhaber and Bosch basically figured out a process to fix nitrogen on an industrial scale and to make ammonia fertilizer. That's how we create synthetic fertilizer, although there's a lot of energy involved in the process. It's basically us emulating soil bacteria, taking nitrogen from the atmosphere, fixing it onto a salt so that we can use it as a fertilizer. They say that nitrogen is responsible for most of the protein in human beings today. Here's a figure that I changed a little bit. Just again, this is from 2011. So in the 7 years since then, we've actually increased atmospheric carbon dioxide, another important gas in the atmosphere, from around then they were saying just over 370 parts per million. And today we've gone over 400 parts per million of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And I know it's kind of open for debate whether it's human caused or not. I think there are definitely natural cycles of CO2 increasing over time. And really the concentrations can fluctuate even in day and night, as you can see here. But could it also be caused somewhat by human activities? That's a question for you guys to ponder on. So what do we do about it? We know that it is causing the greenhouse effect, which is driving climate change, the increasing amounts of carbon dioxide. But in order to actually effectively sequester carbon dioxide, plants have to be able to hold onto it for many years. In fact, they say really planting trees in the short term might affect carbon sequestration. But in the long term, unless those trees are protected, unless you can guarantee that a tree remains there, it's not going to do it. So most crop plants and most plants and really altogether, once that carbon dioxide is released, either through combustion of the crop itself or by consumption of it. So really, we're not effectively storing it in the soil. Couple of just last minute things here I wanted to point out real quick. Sulfur dioxide was a product of coal combustion, and it's not so much a big deal anymore. There for a while it was a huge deal until they created a cap and trade system where they basically eliminated it. However, it's interesting because sulfur dioxide has actually had, in some cases, positive effects on agriculture. We've increased soil sulfur, which has lowered disease pressure in some places, and actually lowered necessity for adding sulfur as a micronutrient. So that's an interesting effect. I'd encourage you guys to look into that. Methane as well is also a big greenhouse gas and causes some major problems. Last thing here, a lot of people are looking at agriculture and particular agricultural practices as ways to sequester carbon. And I think that there's going to be markets for that in the future, doing some carbon farming. So let's end on that note. And does anybody have any last minute questions? I know we're actually over class time, but everybody good? All right, well, check your Blackboard, and also I'm going to put up a little discussion board for you guys to choose a crop to focus on. Remember to be looking at kind of the last chapters in the book. That last unit is just going over particular crops. So use those to try to figure out which crop you want to concentrate on for your crop project. I'll put a little bit more about that on Blackboard so you guys have a little better idea of what to do there and select your crops. All right, well, you guys have a great day. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
You too. Y'all try to stay dry.
Yeah, stay dry out there.
Yep. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.